God's freedom or God's sovereignty and human freedom. Let's take a look at another view. So another view is called limited sovereignty. It is limited in the sense that not everything that occurs in God is God's directive will, what God directs to happen. So it's limited in that sense. Notice too, this is best represented by John Wesley and later a group of his followers called the Arminians, or Arminians are a kind of Wesleyans. God directs some events but permits others. This is called limited sovereignty. So God is not directing, that is writing the novel so that we act a particular way. But God does direct some things, but he allows other things. So this is called limited sovereignty. Providence then, God's direction, works to afford everyone every possible help which can be done without turning man into a machine. So God is influencing us, sometimes directing our freedom, but not always, trying to woo us to him so that we will do good and believe in him and be moral beings. And so the idea is that certain events happen that God does not directly or perfectly will. He simply permits, something like me driving, or allowing my children to drive and perhaps do some things that they should not do. So in that sense, God's sovereignty is limited. Their view of human freedom is a libertarian one. Because God gives us freedom, we must be able to make a choice. And since we have a genuine choice to make, God can't be directing us. God cannot direct us, that is, write us. Think about the novel. God can't write us to do something if that's not what we want to do. And so the human freedom is libertarian, not situated as in the case of Calvinism. God, under this view, does know everything that will occur. Wesley and the Arminians held to the idea that God does know what's going to happen 30 seconds from now, what words I'm going to use 30 seconds from now, but they also hold that I'm free. And the way they answer that is a lot of different ways. One is called Molinism. Another is simply God's simple foreknowledge. But pretty much they have to go with paradox or mystery here to explain it. Some would argue, well, God knows what's going to happen in the future that free creatures will do, not because he directs it, but because God's knowledge is outside of time. God is, as it were, watching a parade from a tall building, and he sees the entire parade from beginning to end. The people in it are free as they march, how many steps, how quickly, who they wave at. All of that's libertarianly done, freedom, they're choosing, but God has seen it all from outside of time. So he knows what's going to happen, but his knowledge doesn't violate their libertarian freedom. At least that's one particular view. Finally, sin is due to the misuse of our libertarian freedom. So this view says God is permitting our sin in that he often does not intervene, but God is not directing us to do evil things. So this view does not have to answer why God would make Judas do something. It's rather God allowed Judas to betray Christ, or God allowed Pharaoh to be wicked, or God allows this virus to perpetuate and harm human beings. So it doesn't get God off the hook for the problem of evil. We've talked about that before. But it does say that sin is due to the misuse of our freedom, not due to the fact that God is directly causing it. And so another way of thinking about this view, again, what are the different ways of thinking about God's relationship to human freedom in this view is, I think a good way of thinking about it is God is a kind of divine movie director. So not a divine novelist, but a movie director who says to the actors and actresses, listen, here's your part. Here are the lines I want you to say and the actions I would like you to do. I hope you'll do these, but when the film starts rolling, the actors and actresses might do something a little bit different. They may not say the exact words or do the exact actions. Now, if the divine movie director doesn't like the scene, She can just stop the direction and recut, give better direction, and film again. But there may be some things she wants in her film that she can't get in the film because of the limitations of her actors. And so you can see how the divine movie director in the end will say, yes, that's a good movie, but there might be a lot of things happening in the film that are not exactly what the director wanted. They may be, in case of movie direction, perhaps more than what the director wanted. As you may know, actors and actresses sometimes will ad-lib various parts, and they'll do things that aren't in the script. But that's okay for the most part, and directors will allow that in the film. So I think this is a good way of thinking about the Arminian understanding of God's relationship to the world. There's a story God's trying to tell. It's going to end up being a good story. There are a lot of things that might happen within the story that the director did not directly want, but he did permit in the film. So a divine movie director. Let's look at our last view of these issues. Our last view is called limited sovereignty, and this is a fairly recent one. By fairly recent, I mean in the last probably 30 years, this view has become more powerful, I should say, in North America especially. That's very recent in terms of a Christian time frame. But it's the idea of God's sovereignty is limited. A good representative of this is open theism. And it's significantly different than the Arminian position, as I'm going to show you in here in just a moment. This view holds that God directs some events but permits others. So in that way, you can see that this view agrees with Arminianism, the position just before. God directs certain things to happen. Axe heads floating, Paul being converted on the road to Damascus, those kinds of things. God wants those things to happen and directs them, but God permits other things. So we have a view of limited sovereignty. Secondly, human freedom is libertarian. So here again, this is like Arminianism. It's libertarian freedom because it believes to be free, I must be able to choose other than I do. I have to have the power of contrary choice. The third view, though, is God does not know all that will occur. This is the big difference between open theism and Arminianism. God does not know what's going to happen in the future, either via timeless knowledge or middle knowledge or Molinism or anything like that. God just doesn't know because those things are not there to know. This is called open theism. It means God is open to the future. It's not closed. God doesn't know the words I'm going to use 30 seconds from now. God knows what words I might use. God knows what words I'm likely to use. God knows what words are available to me. God knows that I'm not going to speak Swahili in 30 minutes. But God does not know exactly which words I will choose because those are free choices and therefore they're not there to know. So this view is different from Arminianism right here. It goes further and says, agreeing with Arminianism, sin is due to a misuse of our freedom, and then God cannot ensure specific goals except through divine intervention. So only if certain kinds of things happen, that God wants specific things to happen, then God will have to intervene and direct. So this view, as you can imagine, has some challenge answering Scripture for things like prophecy. How does this view explain prophetic kind of claims? For example, Jesus said that Peter would deny him 3 times. According to this view, they have a hard time explaining that. They have to explain it in a less than direct fashion, because it appears like we have God's genuine knowledge of what Peter would do there. And there are other examples, too, of God knowing the future completely, and they have to explain that. Now, they would argue that there are certain scriptures in the Old and the New Testament that talk about God not knowing. For example, when Abraham sacrificed Isaac, he raised his hand to sacrifice Isaac at God's command, and God said, Abraham, Abraham, don't sacrifice your son, your only son, for now I know that you trust me and you have faith in me. So they would argue, see, this verse indicates that God didn't know something and then he learned it. And so As I mentioned before, all three of these positions can point to various texts that support their own position and that refute the other position. Now, how was this view, open theism, understand God's relationship to the world? Well, I think it's more like a kind of king in a realm, divine kingship. The king of England, or think about the king of Saudi Arabia or the king of some other nation. They are the sovereign, they control things, they direct things, but there are a whole lot of things going on in that kingdom that they are not aware of, that they don't approve of. But nevertheless, they're still the king, and if they're a good and powerful king like God is, that kingdom will eventually flourish and achieve the purposes of the sovereign king. But there's a whole lot of things that happen that God's not aware of. So that's another way of thinking about God's relationship to the world, as not as a movie director, not as a divine novelist, but as a king within a country, a king within a region. So let's summarize these three positions. How about if we summarize using chess? I like to play chess. I play my wife regularly in chess. She's pretty good. We have some really good matches. I like to challenge. We challenge each other in chess all the time. But how would they think about you're beginning to play a game of chess, or God's playing a game of chess with us? How would that go? According to Calvinism and Arminianism and open theism, according to Calvinism, God has determined every move that will occur in the game. Notice, God doesn't just know the moves. God has determined what they will be. According to Arminianism, God influences every move. He wants a good game. God knows what he's going to choose if this or that happens, and he influences every move. But because we're free, I can choose to move to e4, or choose to castle, or to move my knight this or that way. But God is influencing every move, and open theism agrees on that point. God is influencing each move as we play this divine chess game. Under Calvinism, with regard to the moves, God knows every move before the game even starts. God has determined, God knows it. Why does God know it? Because he determined it. He knows exactly how the moves will go. Remember, he's written the novel. Arminianism, on the other hand, says also agrees that God knows every move right now. So very, very same reason, except remember, the reason God knows every move now prior to the game is either due to timeless knowledge or middle knowledge, we call it, or mystery. God knows. Open theism, however, says that God knows only the possible and the probable moves. God doesn't know the moves because they're not there yet. They're not there to know. And so that's one disagreement between open theism and Arminianism. Finally, how does the game go? Well, nothing happens in the game that God hasn't decreed. The game is going to be exactly the game that God wanted, and God wants a good game. So the game of chess will be good. In Arminianism, with regard to the game, nothing happens that God hasn't decreed or permitted. Every move that happens is either because God wanted it, or at least he permitted it. And so it too is probably going to be a pretty good game, but it will depend on how you and I move our pieces. Finally, in open theism, much happens that God doesn't want, but God will ultimately win the game. God will accomplish his purposes. So I hope you find that image helpful, and especially those different ways of thinking about God's relationship to the world: divine novelist, divine movie director, or the king in a particular realm. That hopefully will bring some clarity with regard to these Christian issues of human freedom and God's sovereignty. We'll take this up when we continue with our next lecture. Hope you all have a great day.